speakers. Thank you so much for this invitation to come speak to you. My name is Thato Morokong. I'm a project officer at the Academy of Science of South Africa, and I will be speaking on science, diplomacy, and unpacking and debunking science diplomacy. Now, just as a background, I'm from the Academy of Science of South Africa, which was inaugurated in May 1996 by the former president of South Africa and patron of the Academy, which is Nelson Mandela.
Dr. Thato, your voice not clear. You are hearing me, dear?
I can hear you. I can switch off the video.
Yes, but your voice is not clear.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I think there is some gap or lag in yes.
I do this. Sorry for that. Apologies, everyone. Can you hear me now?
And please, any of participant, please make yourself mute to can hear the speaker. So please, I ask all participants to mute themselves.
Can you hear me now, Dr. Wala?
Yes, clear, my dear.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. As I was saying, the Academy of Science of South Africa was inaugurated by its then President Nelson Mandela and had adapted the name science to reflect a common way of inquiry rather than an aggregation of the different disciplines, such as the inclusion of the social sciences. The Academy has been recognized as the only official science academy to represent South Africa in the international community of science and serves through has been established by an Act of Parliament, which was number 67 of 2001, and reports to its National Science and Innovation Department, which was formerly known as the Department of Science and Technology, and is a public entity of the department. So the Academy has a twofold mandate, that is to honor and distinguish scholars in the country where they operate in all fields of scientific inquiry, as well as provide scientific evidence-based advice on national and global challenges in support of policy development. Currently, the Academy of Science of South Africa hosts the World Academy of Sciences Sub-Saharan African Regional Partner, which is known as TWAS-SADC, and the South African Young Academy of Science. Now, allow me to just go into the crux of my presentation. And I think the first thing that I need to do is define what we call science. And this is also in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, that science is a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. Now, essentially, we need to go into the very gravitas of who a scientist is. And I heard somebody just this past week speaking about how we use science to mitigate the risk of uncertainty through hypothesis and synthesizing. So I'd just like to also just define diplomacy. Diplomacy is the art of conducting negotiations between representatives of state and usually refers to international diplomacy, which is the conduct of international affairs, which our colleague. So essentially, who's a diplomat? I think this is a rather quirky icebreaker that I saw on the internet, that is a person who tells you to go to hell in such a way that you actually look forward to the trip. And essentially, a diplomat has many jobs. So you can have somebody who works in consulates, somebody who works in embassies, through bilateral diplomacy, which was also alluded to in some of the presentations that were made. We have headquarters of multinational organizations, as well as permanent missions, which is also known as multilateral diplomacy. Now, essentially, where do the two meet? Where does the scientist meet the diplomat? So this is just an extract from The Scientist that says there is a need for a two-way bridge between science and policy. And essentially, the search for scientific bases confronting problems of social policy is bound to fail because of the very nature and the very gravitas of these problems. They are what we call wicked problems. And as somebody who comes from an international relations background, wicked problems are problems that sometimes have contradicting pre-existing conditions and are difficult to mitigate through unilateral decisions. And I think that has also been addressed in previous presentations on the role of the internationalization of science diplomacy, essentially. So in terms of, for instance, water, we have what we call simple, complicated, and complex problems. So we moved from the usual borehole system to actual plumbing, which I essentially would like to dub as complicated, to complex problems. So essentially, in terms of complex problems, we have issues of flooding. We have issues of water use and the management of what we call global commons, which are global shared resources. So I think it's pretty clear that also the COVID-19 pandemic has proven to be a wicked problem that needs multilateral organization in that regard. So wicked problems are essentially transboundary issues. And I think colleagues have also made, reference to issues such as climate change. We also have pollution and the sustainable use of biodiversity, including fisheries, sustainable water management and management of water bodies, communicable and non-communicable diseases. And I think COVID-19 has also proved the valuable contribution that science diplomacy makes in mitigating science diplomacy, in mitigating COVID-19, pardon me for that. So transboundary issues always have a share or say in the SDGs. And I think essentially that's what the SDG seeks to address. And Dr. Wala also made just a very concise introduction of how this training seeks to speak to the SDGs. So essentially, what is science diplomacy? Science diplomacy, I put it to you, is putting your best face forward. So science diplomacy, I think this is also a publication that a colleague also made reference to, which is the New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy, which was published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science in collaboration with the Royal Society, is essentially divided into 3 dimensions in this publication, and that is science and diplomacy, which is informing foreign policy objectives with scientific advice, diplomacy for science, which is facilitating international scientific cooperation, and science for diplomacy, which is using science to improve international relations between countries. So I'd like to put it forward. This is a publication that was put together by Sir Peter Gluckman, who is part of the international, it's called it's a Science Advisors Initiative, and they just speak to the idea that science diplomacy is essentially actions that are designed to directly advance a country's national needs, which is soft power, which was also alluded to initially in some of the presentations that were made, national security and emergency response, economic dimensions, STI, which is science, technology, and innovation on the national front, and things of that nature. These are actions that are designed to address cross-border interests, bilateral cross-boundary issues, shared resources, shared technical services, and things of that nature. These are actions that are primarily designed to meet global needs and challenges, which is the SDGs, and I also spoke of ungoverned spaces and regional water bodies. So science diplomacy is not just another term for international science cooperation. The motivation for international science cooperation is to advance science, whereas the motivation for science diplomacy is to affect relationships. So here we have some of just the international environmental treaties, and I'll just speak just to 2 specifically, which is the Antarctica of 1959, which is regulated international relations. Only continent now, these guys are there will be a contribution of military
Hello, Dr. Thato. You are here?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, because the voice lost for a while.
Oh, apologies for that. My apologies. Am I audible enough now?
It's okay, I hear you now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So another treaty that I'd also like to make mention of is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which bans the stationing of weapons of mass destruction in outer space, as well as prohibits military activities on celestial bodies and details the binding rules governing peaceful exploration and the use of science. And I think it's very important to note that science diplomacy requires an excellence in science. Science has to be prolific in order to influence policy. So as this is also just another piece of legislation that was mentioned of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This conference negotiated what is known as the Paris Agreement, which seeks to speak to the reduction of climate change, and the text to which represented a consensus of representatives of the 196 parties attending the convention. Now the agreement had all countries who have signed it, although one later, at a later stage, withdrew from this agreement. So here we also have, I'm speaking rather to science in diplomacy, we also have the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is known as GERD. So this is a dam that is being built on the Blue Nile in Ethiopia, covering a capacity of 74 billion cubic meters. Now, Sudan and Egypt have been concerned about the impact on water supply. Now, essentially, I put it to you that science is very critical in resolving this dispute, which essentially can be scientists negotiate to extend the period of filling the dam from perhaps 5 to 7 years to about 9 to 12 years. We can look at negotiating to lower the height of the dam and reduce capacity, as well as reduce the flow during the agricultural season. So countries such as Egypt are investigating alternatives such as the treatment of sewage water, diverting the water from Lake Victoria, as well as desalination. Essentially, the ultimate solution lies in the greater cooperation between the Nile Basin countries. So science and diplomacy is that science can present evidence to solve disagreements between countries, and it is rather clear that greater scientific cooperation is needed between neighboring countries if we are to indeed address these transboundary and sometimes wicked problems as well as developmental challenges. And yet, scientific cooperation between African countries is often underdeveloped. So diplomacy for science facilitates international cooperation and advances scientific objectives. This ranges from facilitating permits for scientists to collecting specimens to facilitating major international science projects. Scientists would not have been able to undertake their work if governments did not cooperate. And this may involve scientific cooperation between scientists from countries that sometimes have poor political relationships, but are crucial in brokering relations between set countries. So diplomacy for science, an example that is very crucial is the Square Kilometre Array project, which is known as the SKA, which is an international effort to build the world's largest radio telescope, which will eventually cross over to over a square kilometre, which is 1 million square meters of the collecting area. Now, this SKA is a collaboration between scientists, engineers, and policymakers from all over the world. This comprises of countries such as Australia, China, Germany, Italy, New Zealand, South Africa, and Sweden, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. And almost 100 organizations across close to 20 countries are designing and developing the SKA. South Africa, where I'm currently at, and Western Australia are co-hosting the project. We have about 8 partner countries which will host this project, which is Botswana, Ghana, Kenya, Madagascar, Mauritius, Mozambique, Namibia, and Zambia. And we also have partial observations that started in 2020 and are still being undertaken in that regard. So this is just sort of a picture of depicting some of the member organizations of the SKA as well as the African partners. And I'll move on to the next slide. So in terms of diplomacy and science, I put it to you that the Nelson Mandela African Institute of Science and Technology, which is the NMAIST, based in Arusha, is part of what we call diplomacy for science. Its objective is to educate the next generation of African scientists and engineers by equipping them with technical, entrepreneurial, and leadership capacities to solve African problems, thereby contributing to the economic and social transformation of East Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So science for diplomacy is essentially using scientific cooperation, like I've mentioned, to improve international relations between countries, which is essentially the soft power of science. Science can facilitate engagement at diplomatic level through the sharing of a common scientific language, common scientific methods that are collaborative and address major challenges. However, science diplomacy in Africa has not been explored that much. So, and a good example of science for diplomacy is the synchrotron light for experimental science and applications in the Middle East, also known as SESAME, which officially opened in Jordan, May 2017. Some of the participating countries include these ones that are listed, and there's a diplomatic commitment from these countries that are participating in this project to maintain and develop scientific cooperation and knowledge production. So Sesame Synchrotron is a flash of unity in the Middle East in that a multi-million-pound science project under construction in the Jordan is helping foster peace in the heart of the Middle East. A particle accelerator known as Sesame will be used by researchers to study everything from viruses to new drugs. One of its biggest achievements may also be bringing together scientists from countries that are usually openly hostile to each other. And that also speaks, this was by David Schuckman, and that essentially also speaks to what I dub as, or call, the soft power of science, that is the unifying power of the sciences. So why is science diplomacy important for Africa? Essentially, Africa's present patchwork of diverse and underdeveloped, sometimes also developing nation states, needs science diplomacy more than any other region in the world. Some of the poorest economies come from Africa. 15 are also landlocked with poorly developing cross-country connections. And another reason is that small domestic markets and continental fragmentation means that there is a lack of scale economies in the production and distribution of goods and services. Just as a continuation of the importance of science diplomacy is that science diplomacy can help identify, address, and sometimes diffuse and solve many cross-border or borderless challenges, which is through managing of shared natural resources, resisting and repelling international terrorism, and addressing its cohort of humanitarian issues, that is the very crux of international relations, which is to maintain peace and security. Another very interesting point is that science diplomacy is important in controlling and eradicating human and sometimes animal pandemics. And I think COVID-19 has proven that science diplomacy is important in the sense that we need a multifaceted, multidimensional, multidisciplinary approach to solving this pandemic, because it's essentially proved not only to just be an epidemiological problem, but as well as a transboundary problem, a political problem, and an economic problem. Now, science diplomacy also promotes democratic principles and institutions, which essentially foster popular participation and good governance. Science diplomacy is important in nurturing sound academic and scientific foundations, which also speaks to the idea that the science behind science diplomacy has to be excellent. It has to be prolific. And science diplomacy is also important in achieving economic trade, social and political collaboration, coordination, and convergence. So science diplomacy is important in jointly building competitive knowledge economies to accommodate the varying innovation systems in various countries and sharing lessons learned by these countries who have good systems of policies, governance support structures, and strategies on science, technology, and innovation in place. Science diplomacy also enables the ease of access to research and innovative infrastructures through twinning or exchange programs. Science diplomacy is essential in establishing networks to generate ideas for technology development initiatives and global innovation value chains. And science diplomacy is important for integrated efforts in dealing most pragmatically with wicked problems. And just as a closing thought is that science diplomacy is not just a domain for national governments. It's not just the space in which multinationals operate. It's also not about leaving academia, but it's about using the science in service to society. And with that, thank you so much for the invitation, and I am welcome to taking questions. Thanks very much.